He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. Magnus Crane simply pushed open the door of that rain-soaked diner at 2 in the morning like he owned every second of silence that followed. 6 feet 7 inches of cold, deliberate violence wrapped in a coat too large for any honest man. The truckers didn't look up. The cook didn't flinch. Nobody in that diner understood what had just walked through the door. Nobody except a 24-year-old waitress holding a tray of dirty dishes who felt her stomach drop straight through the floor the moment their eyes met. She knew that look. She had seen it before, in places no young girl should ever have to remember. And she knew, without a single doubt, that if she didn't do something in the next few seconds, everyone in that room was going to die. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us a while, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We find the ones that stop you cold. The ones that make you sit back and ask yourself, what would I have done? Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we bring you every single week. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that diner. The rain had been falling over Chicago for 3 straight hours by the time Naomi Mercer tied her apron strings for the first time at the Lucky Spoon Diner. Not her apron, technically. She'd borrowed it from the woman whose shift she was covering, a regular named Deb who had called in with a stomach bug 40 minutes before the dinner rush, leaving the manager, a barrel-chested Greek man named Stavros, 3 people short on the worst possible night. Stavros had called Naomi because she was the newest hire and therefore the one least likely to say no. She'd only been on the books for 11 days. She hadn't even completed her full training. "You know the menu?" Stavros had asked her over the phone, not really asking. "Most of it," she'd said. "Good enough. Get here by 9. She'd taken 2 buses to get there. The second one smelled like wet dog and industrial cleaner, and the driver had nearly skipped her stop entirely. By the time she pushed through the diner's glass door, her shoes were soaked through, her hair was plastered to the side of her face, and she was already 12 minutes late. Stavros had looked at her like she'd arrived exactly on time. He'd handed her the borrowed apron, pointed at the coffee station, and said, "Table 6 needs a warm-up, and Table 9's been waiting on their check for 20 minutes. Go." That was her orientation. Naomi had nodded, taken a breath she didn't let anyone see, and gone. The Lucky Spoon wasn't the kind of place you'd find in a travel guide. It sat at the end of a 2-lane road off a stretch of highway that most people only drove when they'd missed the main exit. The booths were original, meaning cracked, and the lighting was the particular shade of yellow that made everyone look slightly unwell. The menu hadn't changed in years. The coffee was consistently terrible in a way that had somehow become a point of local pride. Regular customers didn't come for the food. They came because the Lucky Spoon was open when nothing else was, and because Stavros never asked questions about why you needed eggs at 1 a.m. Truckers. Night shift workers. The occasional couple who'd been driving too long and needed 20 minutes off the road. That was the usual population of the Lucky Spoon after midnight. On this particular night, Naomi was working alongside a man named Carl. 50s, slow-moving, burned out in a comfortable way. The kind of veteran server who communicated mostly through sighs and small gestures. He'd shown her where the extra napkins were and told her not to let Table 4 order more than 2 rounds of pie because they never paid for the third. That was the full scope of his mentorship. By 11:30, she had spilled half a glass of water on herself, gotten a coffee order wrong twice, and dropped a fork under a booth that she'd had to fish out with a folded napkin because the floor was genuinely frightening. The couple at Table 3 had been impatient with her. The trucker at the counter had corrected her when she'd read back his order wrong. She'd apologized more times in 2 hours than she normally did in a week. None of it was weakness. It looked like weakness, and she understood exactly how it looked, and she let it look that way because it cost her nothing and bought her something. People stopped watching you once they'd decided you weren't worth watching. She had learned that before she learned anything else. What nobody in the Lucky Spoon knew about Naomi Mercer, what nobody who saw her fumbling with the coffee pot or apologizing over a wrong order would ever have guessed, was that she had grown up inside a trafficking network that moved young people across 4 states and 2 country borders. She had been taken at 13, traded twice, and spent the better part of 4 years inside something so systematically brutal that most people who heard stories about it from a distance immediately assumed the survivors must have been permanently broken. Naomi wasn't broken. She was something harder to explain than broken. She had never become a soldier, never trained in any formal sense. She had no combat background, no weapons expertise, no handler who'd shaped her into an asset. What she had was something more primitive and more durable, a survival intelligence built from thousands of small observations made under conditions where getting something wrong meant getting hurt. She knew how people moved when they were afraid versus when they were prepared. She knew the difference between someone scanning a room casually and someone scanning it with purpose. She knew what it felt like when the temperature of a space changed, not in degrees but in intention. She had been using that knowledge every day since she was 17 and had walked out of a house in rural Indiana on a Tuesday afternoon when every person who was supposed to be watching her had gotten careless for exactly 40 seconds. She'd spent the years since then rebuilding herself from scratch. A GED, community college, a series of jobs that paid badly but kept her moving, kept her in contact with the world, kept her practicing the ordinary rhythms of a life that felt safe. The Lucky Spoon wasn't a destination. It was a paycheck while she figured out what came next. She had not expected it to be anything else. At 12 past 2 in the morning, Naomi was carrying a tray of dirty dishes from table 7 to the kitchen when the front door opened. She almost didn't look up. The door had opened and closed a dozen times that night. Every opening brought a small gust of cold and the sound of rain hitting the parking lot. But this opening was different, and she knew it before she understood why. The man who came through the door was enormous, not heavy. He wasn't fat, wasn't soft anywhere you could see. He was the kind of large that looked structural, like he'd been built rather than born. 6'7" at minimum, maybe more, with shoulders that made the doorframe seem provisional. He wore a dark coat that fell nearly to his knees, and the coat was doing a great deal of work, not just against the weather. He moved slowly, deliberately. The way people moved when they weren't in a hurry because they already knew how everything was going to end. Naomi's tray shifted in her grip. She corrected it without looking down. The man, she didn't know his name yet, didn't know anything about him yet, didn't look at her. He looked at the room. He looked at it the way you'd look at a blueprint, systematically, booth by booth, starting from the left and moving right, the way someone had taught him to. When his eyes reached the far corner booth, they stopped. Naomi followed the line of his gaze without moving her head. In the far corner, half obscured by the angle of the booth's high back, sat a man she had noticed earlier in the evening and then deliberately not noticed again. Medium height, 60 or so, maybe slightly younger. Dressed plainly enough, dark jacket, open collar, but there was something about the way he'd entered 3 hours ago that had registered in the back of her mind and stayed there without demanding attention. He'd come in alone. No phone in his hand, no newspaper, no performance of any kind. He'd ordered soup and coffee, and he'd eaten it slowly, and he'd been refilling his coffee for the past hour, and Naomi had gone to his booth twice, and both times he'd thanked her with a politeness that was real but measured. The kind of manners that come not from charm, but from discipline. He was eating alone in a diner at 2 in the morning without a single person nearby. And now the largest man she had ever seen in her life was standing at the door looking at him the way a problem looks at a solution. She had less than 5 seconds to understand what she was looking at. She used all 5 of them. The big man's coat sat wrong on his left side, not pulled by wind or fabric, but by weight. Something under the coat was throwing off the drape. She'd seen that before. In a very different context, in the back seat of a car she'd spent 3 days in when she was 14. She hadn't known what she was looking at then either. She'd figured it out when the man in the front seat had needed both hands for the steering wheel and the jacket had fallen open. Her stomach didn't drop. That was the thing about real fear. The genuine, life-calibrated kind. It didn't feel like a fall. It felt like a door closing. Quiet. Certain. Final. She kept walking toward the kitchen. She did not speed up. She did not look at the big man again. She set her tray down on the pass-through shelf, her back to the room, and she stood there for exactly the amount of time it would take someone to push through a set of dirty dishes. 4 seconds. 5. And she used those seconds to think. The cook, Raymond, said something to her about an order ready for table 9. 1 second, she said. She said it gently. She said it like a girl who was flustered. She picked up the coffee pot instead of the food. The coffee pot was full and hot. Raymond had just refilled it. She turned around and walked back into the dining room. Carl was at the counter, back to the room, doing something with the register. The couple at table 3 had their heads together over a shared phone screen. The truckers were talking among themselves about something that had made one of them laugh. Nobody was watching the big man move toward the corner booth. Nobody was watching anything except their own small piece of the night. Nobody except her. She angled toward the corner table, not directly, not in a line that would bring her between the big man and his target, not yet. She angled toward table 6, which was close, which was reasonable for a waitress with a coffee pot, which gave her a reason to be in that part of the room without it looking like a reason. The big man had reached the midpoint of the diner. I was moving between the row of booths and the central aisle, slow and deliberate, his right hand hanging close to the left side of his coat. Naomi caught a reflection in the belly of the coffee pot, warped, brown-tinted, distorted the way funhouse mirrors distort. But she could read it. She'd learned to read distortions. The gun was already out of the coat. It was in his right hand, held low against his thigh, the silencer making it longer than it should have been. He hadn't raised it yet. He was close enough that he didn't need to. There was nobody between them. Naomi looked at the reflection for one more second. She looked at the distance between the big man and the corner booth. She looked at the angle. Then she looked at the floor. There was a dinner fork on the dirty tray she'd left on the edge of the pass-through. She hadn't finished clearing the table before she'd grabbed the coffee. The fork had slid to the edge of the tray when she'd set it down. It was sitting there at the lip of the steel shelf, handle facing out, tines pointed toward the wall. Dirty, greasy from whatever had been on the plate beside it. The kind of fork that gets washed 100 times and still somehow never looks entirely clean. She did the math in half a second. Not consciously. She wasn't conscious of doing math. She was just doing what she always did, looking at what was available, looking at what was within reach, looking at what could become something other than what it was. She changed direction. The tray was 3 steps away. She crossed the distance the way she crossed all distances, without urgency, without any visible change in pace. She reached the tray. She picked up the fork. She turned back toward the dining room. The big man was 8 feet from the corner booth. His right hand was starting to come up. Naomi's tray clipped the edge of the pass-through shelf. It wasn't entirely accidental. About 60% of it was accidental. The tray was unbalanced and the shelf was slick, and she had turned too fast. The other 40% of it was the part of her brain that was always running calculations. The tray went over. The sound was catastrophic for a room that quiet. Plates, cups, silverware, a small ceramic creamer, all of it hit the floor tiles in a cascading series of crashes that were individually loud and collectively deafening. The ceramic shattered. The cups rang against the tiles like bells. Every head in the diner swung toward the kitchen pass. Naomi's eyes were already back on the big man. He hadn't stopped. He'd flinched, just slightly, just a fraction of a second, and his gun hand had dipped a few inches. But he hadn't stopped. He was a professional. The crash had startled him the way a professional can be startled while remaining a professional. But it had bought her a heartbeat. She was already moving, not toward the kitchen, not toward cover, toward him. Afterward, when she tried to explain it, to herself mostly, because she rarely explained it to anyone else, she couldn't frame it as bravery. Bravery implies a choice between doing something and not doing something, and she didn't experience it as a choice. She experienced it as a recognition. This was the moment. This was the narrow window inside the window. And she had spent 11 years getting very good at recognizing narrow windows and moving through them before they closed. She went across the aisle. Carl shouted something behind her. She didn't register what. The big man saw her coming with a fraction of a second to react, which was enough time for a professional, which was why she wasn't trying to reach him head on. She was coming from an angle, coming from his left, his weapon side, the side that was most occupied, coming fast and low in a way that no waitress in an apron should have been capable of moving. He brought the gun up. She was already past the barrel. She got inside his reach, not far inside, barely inside, the distance measured in inches. And she drove the dirty dinner fork upward with everything she had into the soft space under his jaw, just behind the chin, where the muscle meets the bone, and there is very little protecting anything important. Magnus Crane made a sound that wasn't a word. His hand convulsed. The gun went off, suppressed but not silent, a sharp pneumatic crack that put a round into the suspended light fixture above the corner booth in a shower of sparks and broken glass. And in the far corner booth, Lucien Vescari, who had been sitting absolutely still throughout all of it, who had not moved, who had not flinched at the dropped tray or the approaching footsteps, dove sideways off the booth seat and hit the floor. The diner erupted. Naomi had 1 second before the massive man recovered. She used it to get both hands on his gun hand. She didn't try to take the weapon. She wasn't strong enough to take it cleanly, and she knew that. She tried to control the muzzle, to point it somewhere that wasn't a person. His hand was like closing her fingers around a structural beam. He outweighed her by at least 150 pounds. His forearm alone was nearly as wide as her torso. But she had the leverage of surprise, and she had the fork still buried in the soft tissue under his jaw, and he had a problem he hadn't planned for. Magnus Crane had been prepared for a clean shot at a seated target. He had not been prepared for a waitress. Nobody ever was. Behind her, she heard the crash of the kitchen door slamming open. She heard Stavros shout something in Greek. She heard from somewhere outside, muffled by rain and walls and distance, but unmistakable once you knew what it was. The sound of another shot, which meant there were more of them outside, which meant the exits were already covered, which meant they were alone in here with whatever was coming next. Naomi drove her knee into the back of Magnus's right leg, felt it buckle slightly, not collapse, just stutter, and used the momentum shift to pull his gun arm downward and sideways. The weapon discharged again, into the floor this time, chips of tile spraying across the bottom of the booth beside them. She had approximately 3 seconds before he recovered fully. She had the fork. She had the angle. She had the knowledge that she had exactly 1 chance to change what happened next before this became something nobody survived. And somewhere under a table in the corner of the Lucky Spoon Diner, the most feared mafia boss in the city of Chicago was on his hands and knees in the dark, breathing hard, very much alive, because of a 24-year-old woman in a borrowed apron who had not run. The night was just beginning. The gun went off a 3rd time. Naomi hadn't expected that. She'd had both hands on Magnus's wrist, her full weight angled into the leverage point, and she'd felt the tendons shift under her grip the way rope shifts when it's about to snap. And then his elbow had come down on her left forearm with the mechanical precision of something that didn't experience pain the way normal people did. And her hands had separated just enough, just that fraction, and the weapon had discharged into the steel counter edge with a spark that threw hot metal shavings across the side of her neck. She felt the sting. She did not stop. What she did instead was drop. Not fall. Drop. Intentionally, bending at the knees and letting her weight pull straight down so that Magnus's follow-through went over her instead of into her. His elbow caught air. His momentum carried him half a step forward, and she came back up inside that half step with the fork, still in her left hand, slick with something she wasn't going to think about, and drove it into the meat of his right forearm. Magnus made the sound again. Not a word. Not a grunt exactly. Something between the two. Something involuntary. His gun hand spasmed. The weapon dropped. It hit the floor and slid under the counter, and Naomi went after it on instinct, and Magnus's boot came down 2 inches from her fingers, and she rolled sideways across broken ceramic and wet tile and fetched up against the base of the coffee station with her shoulder screaming at her. "Hey!" That was Carl. He was pressed against the wall beside the register, both hands flat against the paneling like he was trying to push himself through it. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. "Hey, hey, hey! Get down!" Naomi said. "Get on the floor and stay there." He did. Immediately, without argument, like he'd been waiting for someone to give him permission. Magnus had straightened. He'd pulled the fork out of his forearm and dropped it on the floor with a sound like someone setting down car keys. Casual, almost contemptuous. He was looking at her with the first expression she'd seen on his face. Not anger, not surprise, but something she could only describe as recalibration. He was updating his assessment of her. She could see it happening behind his eyes the way you could see weather changing on the horizon. She did not give him time to finish updating. She grabbed the coffee pot off the station behind her, the one Raymond had filled 20 minutes ago, the one that was still hot enough to raise blisters. And she threw it. Not at his face. She wasn't trying to blind him permanently. She was trying to make him move his hands. The pot hit his chest, and the lid came off, and the coffee went wide, catching his left shoulder and the side of his neck. And Magnus moved his hands up reflexively, both of them, the way anyone would, the way the body overrules the brain when it registers heat. In the 2 seconds that bought her, she crossed the distance to where the gun had slid. She got her hand on it. She had fired a gun exactly once in her life. She was not about to pretend otherwise, but she had spent enough time around people who carried them to know the basics. Which end was which, where the safety lived on most common designs, how to hold it so you didn't break your own thumb when it cycled. She got the weight of it in both hands, thumbs clear, and came up off her knees into a crouch with the muzzle pointed at the center of Magnus Crane's chest. He had stopped moving. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, he was completely still. They looked at each other across 8 feet of destroyed diner. The overhead fixture she'd knocked out was still sparking intermittently from where the stray round had hit it. Somewhere behind her, Stavros was on the phone. She could hear his voice, low and rapid, not Greek this time, English, saying words like, "Need someone now," and "Yes, I'm sure." Carl was on the floor near the register doing his best impression of furniture. The couple from table 3 had made it to the kitchen at some point. She'd heard the back door slam 5 minutes ago, and she hoped they'd kept running. From outside, the rain was still coming down. From outside, no other sound, no sirens, no voices. Nothing. That silence was the part that scared her more than Magnus. "Sit down," she said. Magnus looked at the gun, then at her, then at the gun again. "I know what you're doing," she said. "You're calculating whether I'll actually use it. Stop calculating. Sit down." He didn't move. "I'm not going to ask you again," she said. "And I'm close enough that it doesn't matter that I've never done this before. At this range, I could use my elbow." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't fear. She wasn't under any illusion that it was fear. It was the recalculation again, the same cold arithmetic she'd seen earlier, working through new variables. He sat. He picked a booth, not the one closest to him, but the second one, the one with better sightlines to the door, and she noted that because it told her something about how he thought. And he sat down in it with the careful deliberateness of a man at a board meeting. "Where are the others?" she said. He said nothing. "There was a shot outside, at least one. How many people came with you?" Nothing. "How many are still out there?" He looked at her the way people looked at weather, patient, without investment. She heard movement from the far corner and almost put the muzzle on it before she caught herself. It was the man from the corner booth. Lucian Vescari, though she still didn't know his name. She just knew the shape of him as he came up from behind the overturned table, one hand braced on the booth seat, his jacket torn at the shoulder from when he'd hit the floor. He was bleeding from a cut above his left ear, thin and bright, running down the side of his jaw in a slow line. He'd found something on the floor. She couldn't see what, not immediately, and he was holding it low at his side. He looked at Magnus. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the gun in Naomi's hands. Then he looked at Magnus again, and his face did something complicated that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, but was something that lived between the two in a way she didn't have a word for. "How many?" he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected, controlled. The kind of voice that had been raised many times in its life and had learned the hard way that volume was a resource you didn't waste. Magnus didn't answer him either. Lucien walked toward them slowly. She noticed he moved with a slight list to the left, something in his hip, maybe old, maybe fresh. But he moved steadily, and when he got to within arm's reach of Magnus's booth, he stopped and looked down at the man with an expression that was so completely absent of surprise that it communicated something louder than surprise. "Renko," he said. Not a question, not to Magnus, to himself or to the air. It had to be Renko. Magnus's eyes moved just slightly, just enough. Lucien saw it. "There it is," he said quietly. "Who's Renko?" Naomi said. Lucien looked at her for a moment like he was deciding something. Not whether to answer, something more than that. Whether she was someone who was about to be inside a truth she couldn't walk back out of. "Someone who used to work for me," he said. She held his gaze. "And now?" "Now he does this." Lucien gestured at the room. The broken glass, the upended furniture, the sparking light, Magnus Crane sitting in a diner booth like a glacier in a dress shirt. "He does this instead." She wanted to ask more. She didn't have time. The kitchen door banged open. Not Stavros this time. Stavros was still near the phone. She could see him in her peripheral vision. This was someone else. Someone who came through the kitchen door moving fast and low with something in their hand, and Naomi was already turning before she'd consciously registered the movement. The man from the kitchen, medium height, dark clothes, a face she wouldn't have remembered in any other context, raised his weapon. Lucien moved. She had not expected him to be fast. She had not expected much from a 60-year-old man with a limp who'd spent the last several minutes on the floor of a diner. What he did was not elegant. It was not the kind of movement that got written down and taught to other people. He simply got to the man before the man expected it, using the same physics principles she'd used on Magnus. He got inside the space where the weapon was useful before it could be made useful, and the thing he'd picked up off the floor turned out to be a length of steel table leg that had separated from one of the overturned tables, and he used it across the man's forearm once, hard, and the gun came down. Then he used the table leg across the back of the man's head. The man went down and didn't come back up. The room was ringing, or maybe that was her ears. She'd been in close proximity to 3 suppressed rounds and 1 unsuppressed whatever that was. And the aggregate was a high, thin whine that sat at the top of her hearing like something trying to get out. "Behind you," said Lucien. She spun. Magnus was out of the booth. He was fast. She had registered him as large, as dangerous, as deliberate. She had not fully registered how fast he was until he was already out of the seat and across the distance with his hand extended toward her gun arm, and she twisted sideways and he caught her forearm instead of her wrist, which was worse in some ways and better in others because it meant he had leverage but not control. And she fired. She didn't aim. She couldn't aim. She just fired in the direction she was being pushed, which was sideways and down, and the round went somewhere into the far wall of the diner in a place that she hoped hadn't had anyone in it. Magnus's grip on her forearm was extraordinary. Not painful exactly. Pain is a signal, and signals can be processed, prioritized, set aside, but structural. It was like having her arm in a vice that was also making decisions. He was pulling her toward him and rotating at the same time, trying to get her turned around, trying to get her off balance in a direction he could use. She stopped fighting the pull. That was the thing people got wrong, in her experience. Limited as it was, raw and unschooled as it was. They fought the pull. They braced against it. And then the person pulling had all the leverage and all the momentum, and you got put where they wanted you. She went with the pull. She went fast, faster than he was pulling, and the sudden forward momentum brought her shoulder into his chest instead of his arms. And the impact was like running into a wall, but the wall moved, which was the point. They went backward together, 2 steps, 3, and hit the edge of the counter. Magnus grunted. She got her left elbow up under his chin. Not a strike, just positioning. And she pushed. It didn't move him far. It didn't have to. It created exactly enough space for her to bring the gun around to where it was pressing against the side of his rib cage. They both went still. His breath was on the top of her head. She could feel the heat of it. "I'm not joking," she said. Her voice surprised her. It was level. It was almost calm. It was the voice of someone who had spent years talking herself out of things that could kill her and had gotten good at sounding like the ceiling when the room needed a ceiling. "I hit your arm once tonight. I'll hit something worse." The hand on her forearm loosened, not completely, but enough. "Let go," she said, "and sit back down." He let go. She stepped back. She kept the gun on him. Her arm was shaking slightly, not from fear, from the simple physical effort of the last several minutes, and she pressed her elbow against her side to minimize the shake. Magnus looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back to the booth and sat down again. Stavros appeared from behind the counter. He had been crouched behind it during the last exchange, and he came up with the careful posture of someone not entirely sure the ceiling was finished falling. He looked at Naomi. He looked at Magnus. He looked at Lucien, who was wiping something off his hands with a dish rag. "I called Greco," Stavros said. Lucien didn't look up from the dish rag. "How long?" He said 15 minutes. "Then we have a problem," Lucien said, "because there are at least 2 more outside and 15 minutes is a long time." Naomi looked at him. "How do you know there are 2 more outside?" "Because Renko doesn't do this with fewer than 4, Lucien said. He finally looked up. 1 anchor, 1 safety, 2 field. Magnus here is the anchor. The man who came through the kitchen was the safety." He glanced at the man on the floor, who was breathing but not conscious. "Which leaves 2 more, 1 on the north exit and 1 on the perimeter." "You've seen this before," she said. "I've seen it before." She processed that. The shot outside. When this started. That was one of yours? Lucien's expression did something she couldn't read. Not mine. No. My people aren't here tonight. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because someone told them not to be. She let that sit. She let it sit because pulling on that thread right now, in this room, with the exits covered and the clock running, would not help anyone. She could pull on it later. She filed it away in the place where she put things that needed to come back to. Okay, she said. So we have 15 minutes and 2 people outside we can't see. She looked at Stavros. Are there cameras? 1. Front parking lot. Can you see the feed? In the office. Back of the kitchen. Go look. Tell me what's there. Stavros moved. She heard his footsteps going quick through the kitchen, the swing of the back door, the creak of the office. A converted storage closet. She'd seen it when she came in. Lucien was watching her. She didn't look back at him directly. She kept Magnus in her sightline and let her peripheral vision handle Lucien. You're not going to ask me who I am, Lucien said. I know who you are, she said. Silence. Not your name, she said. I don't know your name, but I know what you are. She adjusted her grip on the weapon slightly. I've been in rooms with people like you before. Not by choice. No, he said carefully. I imagine not. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not keeping you alive because of anything you are. I'm keeping you alive because there are 4 other people in this building and they didn't sign up for any of this. She heard Carl's voice from the floor near the register. Quiet, strained. 5. There's a family in the bathroom. Came in about an hour ago. Mom, Dad, 2 kids. I told them to lock the door when it started. Naomi closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. 5 other people. Okay, she said. It wasn't okay. Nothing about it was okay. But okay was the word that meant I have received this information and I am still functional, and that was the only word that fit. From the kitchen, Stavros called back. I got the feed. Front lot. There's a black SUV parked behind the dumpsters. I can see... A pause. The pause had texture to it. I can see one guy on the south side of the building. He's got something long. Rifle, maybe. He's watching the door. Just the one? That I can see? Which meant the 4th one was somewhere the camera didn't reach. Naomi looked at Magnus. The 4th one. Where? Magnus looked at the table. You're not getting out of here either way, she said. If Renko gets what he came for, you're a loose end. If he doesn't, you're a failure. Either way, you're not getting paid and you're probably not going home. She watched his face. Tell me where the 4th one is, and you get to walk out of this room on your feet. Magnus's jaw worked slightly. Not words, just the movement of someone who had a response they were choosing not to give yet. The roof, Lucien said quietly. He wasn't looking at Magnus. He was looking at the ceiling, at a water stain in the corner that Naomi had noticed when she'd first come in. Renko always puts one on the roof. It's a habit of his. He thinks it's an advantage. A pause. It usually is. How do they get down? She said. Fire ladder, north side. She thought. The north side was opposite the camera. Of course it was. If we try the back exit, she started. The kitchen door opens to an alley, Lucien said. If the perimeter man is on the roof, he can see the alley from the north edge. So front and back are covered. Yes. Windows? Main dining room faces the front lot. The south window is beside the bathroom hallway. If the rifleman is on the south side, he is, Stavros called. He just moved. He's covering the south window now, too. Naomi stood in the middle of the Lucky Spoon diner at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning with a gun. She didn't know how to use, well, a mafia boss with a bleeding head, an unconscious body on the kitchen floor, a 7-foot assassin sitting in a booth waiting for his moment, a cook on the phone, a server on the floor, a family locked in a bathroom, a sniper on the south side, and a ghost on the roof. She thought of something her caseworker had told her back when she was 18 and newly out and trying to figure out how to exist in the ordinary world. A woman named Sylvia, heavyset, practical, no patience for sentimentality, who had handed her a bus pass and a list of resources and said, without preamble, the situation you're in is never the situation you thought you were in. The real situation is always 3 layers down. Don't try to solve what's on top. Find the third layer. She looked at Magnus. She looked at Lucian. She looked at the kitchen door. She thought about the family in the bathroom. 2 kids. She didn't know how old. She didn't know if they were young enough that they hadn't understood what the sounds had been, or old enough that they understood exactly. She thought about the north exit, the fire ladder, the roof. She thought about the fact that Renko, whoever Renko was, whatever he was, had planned this carefully. 4 people, 2 exits covered, the anchor inside, the safety in the kitchen, clean and professional and tight. The kind of plan that assumed the target would try to run, would try to fight conventionally, would do what targets normally did. But Renko had not planned for the diner to already be compromised before the anchor secured the room. Renko had not planned for a dropped tray. Renko had not planned for the fork. Naomi looked at Carl, still on the floor. "You know this building," she said. "How old is it?" Carl blinked at her. 50 years? 60? What's under the floor?" He stared. "What?" "Original construction, 50 years old. Is there a basement, a crawl space, any utility access?" Carl thought about it with the particular expression of a man being asked to remember something he'd never thought was important. Yeah, an old utility corridor. Goes under the kitchen, comes out at the old loading dock on the east side. Stavros uses it to run the electrical. Nobody's been in it in years. The access panel is in the back of the dry storage. East side. The camera was facing front. The rifleman was on the south side. The ghost was on the roof, watching the north alley and the back exit. Nobody was watching the east side. Not because Renko had made a mistake, because there was nothing on the east side anyone would look at. An old loading dock, a closed door, the back of a building that hadn't been used for anything in years. 3 layers down. "Stavros," she called, "where does the utility corridor come out exactly?" His voice came back thinned by distance and walls. "Old dock. There's a steel door, padlocked from the outside, but the padlock's been broken for 2 years. Stavros keeps meaning to replace it." She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. She looked at Lucien. "Can you move?" He straightened slightly, testing something she couldn't see. "Yes." "Your hip. It's manageable." "I need it to be more than manageable." He held her gaze. "It will be," he said. And something in the way he said it, not aggressive, not defensive, simply direct in the way of someone who had run out of reasons to lie, made her believe him. She looked at Magnus. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what she'd said, that he could walk out on his feet. She thought about whether she'd meant it. She thought about the gun in her hand and what it meant that she was holding it, and what it meant that she was considering what she was considering. "You're going to stay here," she told Magnus. "You're going to sit in that booth, and you're going to stay there. And if you don't—" She looked at Stavros's direction, toward the back. "Stavros, is there anything in the dry storage that isn't food?" A long pause. "There's zip ties." Stavros said, with the tone of a man who was deciding not to ask why he knew that. "Left shelf. Also a fire extinguisher." "Get the zip ties," she said. "Carl." Carl looked at her from the floor. "Get up. I need your help." Carl got up. He didn't ask questions. His face was still the color of old newspaper, but his hands had steadied, and he got to his feet like a man who had decided that the girl with the gun was the safest person in the room, and he might as well stay close to her. They had maybe 11 minutes before Greco, whoever that was, arrived. 11 minutes was either enough or it wasn't. Either the corridor under the kitchen was a way out, or it was a dead end that smelled like 50 years of electrical insulation and bad decisions. Either Renko's 4th man had thought to check the east side, or he hadn't. 3 layers down. Naomi turned toward the kitchen, and that was when Magnus Crane moved. He didn't go for her. She'd expected him to go for her. It was the obvious move, the logical move, the move she'd prepared for. Instead, he went sideways, out of the booth, away from the direction of the gun, moving toward the back wall of the diner in a direction that took him away from her and away from Lucien and toward the family bathroom hallway. She understood it instantly, and it was worse than anything else he could have done. He wasn't trying to escape. He was going for the bathroom. He was going for the leverage. "No," she said, and she was already moving, not thinking, just moving, the way she'd moved across the aisle the first time, the narrow window. The one chance. And she got between Magnus and the bathroom door with less than a foot to spare, her back against the hallway entrance, the gun up. And he stopped. He was 3 feet away. He was breathing evenly. She was not. His eyes were on her, not on the gun, on her face. Specific on the part of her face that would tell him whether she was about to do what was necessary or whether she was about to hesitate. She didn't hesitate. She looked back at him with eyes that had learned, in a very specific and irreversible way, what it cost to hesitate at the wrong moment. She looked back at him with 11 years of clarity that had been purchased at a price no one should ever have to pay. And she said very quietly, "Step back." He stepped back. 1 step. 2. "Sit down," she said. From behind the bathroom door, small and muffled and heartbreaking, a child's voice. Young. Maybe 4, maybe 5. Saying something she couldn't make out, asking something, asking a question the way children asked questions, without any awareness that the world had run out of safe answers. Magnus sat down. Naomi stood at the hallway entrance with her back straight and the gun in both hands and her heartbeat loud in her own ears. And she thought 11 minutes. Then she thought probably less. Then she thought about the utility corridor under the kitchen floor and the broken padlock on the east door and the gap in Renko's plan that existed not because he was careless, but because he was only human, and humans made assumptions, and the assumption was that there was nothing on the east side worth watching. She was going to have to prove that assumption wrong. She was going to have to do it in the next few minutes with a borrowed apron, a gun she barely knew how to fire, a mafia boss with a bad hip, a cook who communicated in size, and a veteran server whose hands had finally stopped shaking. She looked at Lucian. "Tell me about Renko," she said. "Everything. Fast." And the expression that crossed Lucian Vescari's face then, complicated and tired and carrying the specific weight of a man confronting the consequences of a choice made years ago in a room very different from this one, told her that whatever came next was going to be harder than what had already happened. She held his gaze and waited. Lucian didn't sit down to tell it. He stood with his back against the overturned table and his arms crossed and his eyes on a point somewhere between Naomi and the middle distance. And he talked the way people talked when they were recounting something they'd spent considerable energy not recounting. Not fast, not slow. Measured. Like he was rationing the words because some of them cost more than others. "Viktor Renko," he said. 41 years old. Born in Odessa. Came to Chicago 17 years ago with $40 and a name that nobody here recognized. A pause. "I gave him a job. Runner, at first. Then collections. Then he ran a territory for me on the west side for 6 years, and he ran it clean, which is harder than it sounds." "What happened?" Naomi said. "He got ambitious." Lucian said it without heat. "Which is not a crime in my world. Ambition is what I look for. The crime is what he did with it." He uncrossed his arms. 3 years ago, Renko started building something separate. His own network, using my infrastructure, my contacts, my roots. I was careful about it, careful enough that I didn't find out for 14 months. "What was he moving?" Lucian looked at her directly. "People," he said. The word landed in the room and sat there. Naomi's grip on the gun did not change. Her breathing did not change. Her face did not change. But something behind her eyes shifted in a way that Lucian, who was watching her carefully, registered without commenting on. "I shut it down," he said. "When I found out. I shut it down, and I removed the people who had been involved, and I made clear what the consequences were for that category of business." He said the last sentence with a flatness that told her everything she needed to know about what consequences meant in his vocabulary. Renko was already gone by then. He'd seen it coming. He moved first. "And now he's doing this," she said. "He can't rebuild while I'm operating. He knows that. He's known it for 3 years. Lucian touched the cut above his ear, briefly, the way you'd touch something without meaning to. Tonight was supposed to be the solution. She processed this. All of it. The trafficking network. The shutdown. The 3 years of Renko rebuilding patience into something that had walked through a diner door at 2 a.m. with a suppressed handgun and 4 trained men. She thought about being 14 in the back seat of a car. She thought about a lot of things in a very short amount of time, and then she put all of them away. "Okay," she said. "The corridor, let's move." Stavros came back from the dry storage with a handful of zip ties and a fire extinguisher and an expression that said he had understood, in the time it took him to find those things, that his diner was never going to look the same again. He zip-tied Magnus's wrist to the steel support bar that ran under the booth table, an original fixture, welded in, not going anywhere. And he did it with the efficiency of a man who had done something like this before, which Naomi noted without pursuing. Magnus led him. He sat with his hands secured and his face blank and his eyes on Naomi, and she kept the gun on him until the last zip tie clicked, and then she handed the weapon to Lucian. He took it without comment. He checked the remaining rounds with a practiced motion that took under 2 seconds and told her everything she'd already suspected about his background. Carl was standing near the bathroom hallway. "What do I do?" he said. "Stay here," Naomi said. "Watch him." She looked at Magnus. "If he moves, you yell." "I'm a server," Carl said. "You're a server with a fire extinguisher," she said. "That's more than most people have." Carl looked at the extinguisher in Stavros's hands. Stavros handed it to him. Carl held it the way people held things they were not sure were adequate. "The bathroom," Naomi said. "Which parent knocks first, usually?" Carl blinked. "What?" "If there's a mother and a father in there with 2 kids, who's going to be closest to the door? Who's the one managing the situation?" He thought about it. "Mom. She had them on her lap when they went in." Naomi went to the bathroom door. She stood to the side of it, not in front of it, to the side. And she knocked twice, soft, then once more. "I'm a staff member," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "I need you to listen to me carefully. You're safe where you are. I need you to stay in there and stay quiet for a little longer. Can you do that?" Silence. Then, "Yes." A woman's voice, tight, controlled, doing her best. "Good," Naomi said. "Keep the door locked. I'll knock the same way when it's clear." She stepped back from the door and looked at Stavros. "Show me the access panel." The dry storage was a narrow room off the back of the kitchen, shelving on both sides, industrial cans of tomato product, and institutional-sized containers of cooking oil, and a wall of dry goods in white bags. The access panel was at the back of the room at floor level, a 2-foot square of plywood painted the same color as the wall at some point in the past 30 years, currently the color of old teeth. Stavros crouched and pulled it open by a lip of exposed wood, and the smell that came out was 50 years of insulation and settled dust and the specific cold mineral smell of old concrete. The corridor beyond was low, 4 feet, maybe slightly more. It ran left and right in the yellow cone of Stavros's phone flashlight, concrete block walls, electrical conduit running along the ceiling, a floor that was poured concrete with a fine skin of dust that had been undisturbed long enough to look almost like carpet. "How far to the east door?" Naomi said. 30 meters, Stavros said. "Maybe a little more. It goes straight." "Anything in the way?" "Old equipment. Dehumidifier I put down there 2 years ago. Some shelving I moved when I redid the storage." He aimed the flashlight down the corridor. In its beam, she could see the vague shapes of things. "It's passable." She looked at Lucian. "You said it's manageable." "I said it would be," he said. 4 feet of clearance. You'll be bent the whole way." "I've been in worse." She believed him. She wasn't sure if that was reassuring or not. "Stavros comes with us," she said. "Carl stays with Magnus." Carl's expression suggested he would have preferred the corridor. They went in order. Naomi first, then Lucian, then Stavros, pulling the panel mostly shut behind them. The darkness was immediate and total outside the phone flashlight's beam, and the cold was the kind of cold that came from concrete that never saw daylight, damp and permanent. She moved fast as she could, bent at the waist, hands brushing the walls on both sides to keep her orientation, the flashlight held forward and slightly down to see the floor. Behind her she could hear Lucian's breathing, controlled, deliberate, with the very slight hitch of someone managing pain with the conscious part of their brain so the rest of them could do something else. She didn't comment on it. She moved. The dehumidifier loomed up on the right side at what she estimated was the halfway point, a boxy machine the size of a small refrigerator, pushed against the wall. She angled around it. Her elbow caught the corner and she felt it as distant information. Not important. Filed away. 20 meters. 10. The flashlight found the door. Steel, like Stavros had said. Original to the building, she guessed. Heavy gauge, surface rusted in the seams but structurally intact. The padlock on the interior hasp was a newer model, but Stavros had been right. It was hanging open, the shackle not fully seated. She pulled it free and set it on the floor beside the door, as quiet as she could manage. She put her ear to the door. Rain. The continuous percussion of it on the loading dock above. Wind moving around the east corner of the building. Nothing else. No footsteps. No breathing. No sound of a person trying to be quiet, which was the sound she was listening for. She looked back at Lucian. I was 3 feet behind her, bent nearly double in the low space, one hand on the wall. In the backscatter of the flashlight, she could see the cut on his head had continued bleeding, a slow track of it down the left side of his jaw, dripping off his chin at intervals. He hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't asked. The dock, she said quietly. If Renko's man is on the roof and he's watching the north alley and the back exit, he'd have to physically move to cover the east side. You're sure Renko always uses north for the roof position? His father was military, Soviet, trained in Odessa. The doctrine they used put the elevated position on the north perimeter for line of sight to the primary exit. Lucian said this very quietly and very steadily, like reciting something from memory. Renko grew up hearing it. He applies it without thinking. Old training, she said, the most dangerous kind. She looked at the door. She thought about what was on the other side. The dock, a raised concrete platform, maybe 3 feet off the ground, open to the east. Beyond that, the back of the property. A chain-link fence, a gap in the fence where Stavros said the old delivery trucks used to access. And beyond that, a service road that ran parallel to the highway. If they could reach the service road, they could move. If they could move, they could put distance between the building and the family in the bathroom and the man zip-tied to a booth and Carl standing in the dark holding a fire extinguisher. She put her hand on the door handle. On 3, she said. She didn't say it to Lucian. She said it to herself. A habit. An old one. A way of making her brain commit to movement before it could finish calculating all the reasons not to. 1. 2. She pulled the door. The cold hit her first. Wet and immediate rain-carrying wind that came around the east corner in a gust. The dock was there, exactly as described, 6 feet wide and running the length of the building's east face, covered by a shallow overhang that did almost nothing against the sideways rain. Empty, concrete. Old loading equipment pushed to one end, rusted past any use. She stepped out, stayed low, moved right, toward the cover of the old equipment. Behind her, Lucian came through the door and straightened. The first time he'd stood fully upright since the kitchen, and she saw his face do something involuntary for just a second, the brief and unguarded expression of a joint that had been compressed too long finally releasing. He controlled it immediately. He was already scanning the roofline. Stavros came out last, pulling the steel door behind him to its frame without letting it latch. They stood in the rain on the old loading dock on the east side of the Lucky Spoon Diner, and nobody shot at them, which meant the roofman hadn't moved, which meant they had a path. Naomi was already looking at the fence. 40 feet. The gap was where Stavros had described it, a section where the chain link had come off the post on one side, leaving a gap wide enough to move through without climbing. She looked at it, calculated the time to cover the distance, looked at Lucian's hip, recalculated. She was about to move when Lucian put his hand on her arm. Not grabbing, just contact. She stopped. He was looking at his phone. He'd had it in his jacket the whole time. She hadn't seen him check it until now. I was looking at the screen with the particular expression of someone reading something that required immediate restructuring of everything they'd thought they understood. She looked at the screen. 3 words in a text message from a number saved as a contact name she couldn't make out in the rain and dark. 3 words that Lucian read once, then again, then lowered the phone and stood very still in the rain. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. His face had changed. The control was still there, but it was doing more work than it had been doing a moment ago. "Greco isn't coming," he said. She stared at him. "What do you mean Greco isn't coming?" "The message is from my lawyer," Lucian said. "Greco was picked up 40 minutes ago. Federal warrant, asset seizure, all of it, simultaneously." He looked at the phone again, as if checking whether the words had changed. They hadn't. Someone coordinated the timing. "With Renko?" "With Renko's money," he said. "Or with whoever is buying what Renko's selling." He put the phone in his pocket. This wasn't just tonight. This was everything at once. The operation, the legal exposure, all of it at the same time. He stopped, started again. Someone fed the information to the federal agencies. Someone who had access to it. Someone inside your organization, she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. Naomi stood in the rain on the loading dock and felt the shape of the night rearrange itself around her. Not getting worse. It had already been as bad as it could be, she'd thought, but getting different, getting larger, getting deeper in the way that Sylvia had meant when she'd said 3 layers down. The first layer, an assassination attempt in a roadside diner. The second layer, Victor Renko, 3 years of planning, 4 trained men, coordinated entry. The third layer, whatever this was, whatever it meant that Greco had been picked up at the same moment Magnus had walked through the door, that the federal timing and the physical timing had been synchronized, that someone inside Lucian's organization had been moving pieces for long enough that everything had arrived at the same place on the same night. She thought about the shot outside before the fight had started. The shot from outside the building that Lucian had said wasn't his people. The shot outside, she said, when this started. Not yours, you said. Not mine. Then whose? He was quiet. Lucien. She said his name for the first time. She hadn't known it until he'd said it to his lawyer in that text, but she said it now with the directness of someone who needed to collapse the distance between them immediately. Whose shot was it? I don't know, he said. That's not good enough. I know it isn't. Someone shot one of Renko's people before this started, before Magnus came through the door, which means someone was already here, already outside, already watching. She looked at the roofline, at the dark edge of the building against the black sky. Someone was watching Renko watch you. Lucian's jaw tightened. Is there anyone in your organization who would know about tonight? She said. Who you were meeting, where you were going, why you came here without your security. He was quiet for a moment too long. Lucien. I came here to meet someone, he said. That's what tonight was. Not dinner, a meeting. Someone asked me to come here, to come alone, said they had information about Renko's location, said it was time sensitive. The rain was loud on the dock overhang, loud enough that she had to concentrate on his voice. Who asked you? She said. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the thing she'd seen earlier, the weight of a choice made in the past arriving at the present with all its accumulated interest. Greco, he said. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Greco told you to come here alone tonight, she said. And Greco just got picked up on a federal warrant that someone coordinated with the timing of this attack. Yes. So either Greco was compromised, she said, or Greco is the one who... I know what it means, Lucian said. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had spent 30 years building something that the world called an empire and other people called something much worse. And she looked at the specific quality of pain that was on his face right now. And it was not the pain of a wound or a chase or a difficult night. It was the pain of a name, of a person, of the particular devastation of discovering that someone you had trusted was the architecture of your destruction. She had seen that pain before. Not in her own face. She had never had the luxury of trusting people the way it hurt to have them betray you, but she had seen it in others. It looked exactly like this. She looked away. She gave him the 2 seconds that was all they had. Okay, she said. If Greco set you up, there's no one coming, no reinforcements, no cavalry. Whatever we do with what we have. Yes, he said, which is us, and Stavros and Carl with a fire extinguisher. Yes. She thought of something. The man who came through the kitchen, she said. Magnus's safety, still on the floor. Unconscious, Lucian said. Was he when we left? A pause. They looked at each other. Naomi was already moving back toward the steel door. She pulled it open and went back into the corridor, not bent at the waist this time, but moving as fast as she could in the low space. One hand on the wall, no flashlight. Stavros had the phone, and she didn't wait for him. She moved by feel and memory, counting her steps. The dehumidifier on the right at 20, the door at 45. She came up through the access panel into the dry storage, and through the dry storage door into the kitchen in under 90 seconds. The kitchen floor was empty. The man she had last seen unconscious on the tiles with a table leg across the back of his head was gone. There was blood where his head had been, a a smear of it on the tile, a drag mark leading not toward the back door but toward the dining room. She stood at the kitchen entrance and looked through the pass-through window into the dining room. Carl was on the floor, not in the position he'd been in earlier, not crouched voluntarily near the register. He was on his back, one arm at a wrong angle, not moving. The fire extinguisher was on the floor 6 feet from him with the pin still in it. Magnus Crane was standing. The zip ties were not on his wrists. They were on the floor of the booth, cut cleanly, not broken, cut. Which meant the second man, the kitchen man, had come to with a knife or something like a knife, and had come into the dining room and done what was needed. Magnus had his hands free. He was standing in the middle of the dining room looking at the kitchen entrance, looking at her. The second man was beside him, shorter, darker, holding something in his right hand. She couldn't see it clearly through the pass-through glass. His head had a dark patch above the ear where the table leg had hit, but he was upright and his eyes were clear, and he was holding the thing in his right hand steadily. Between Magnus and the second man in the bathroom hallway, nothing, no Carl, no fire extinguisher, no obstacle at all. Naomi looked at the bathroom door. It was still closed. 2 knocks, then 1. She hadn't knocked that way. Nobody had knocked that way since she'd last spoken to the woman inside. The woman inside who had 2 children. Magnus followed her gaze to the bathroom door. He looked back at her. He said for the first time since he'd walked through the door of the Lucky Spoon, something out loud. His voice was low and without inflection. "Come out of the kitchen," he said. "Bring whoever came back with you. Hands where I can see them." A pause. "Or I go to the bathroom door." He didn't gesture toward it. He didn't move toward it. He said the words with the specific flatness of someone who had made this kind of statement before and had never had to repeat it, because the people on the other end of it understood immediately and completely that the statement was not conditional. Naomi stood at this kitchen entrance with her hands visible and empty and her heart loud in her own chest, and a distance of 30 feet between her and a door behind which a woman she had never met was sitting on a bathroom floor with 2 children who didn't understand why they were there, or how long they'd be there, or whether the person who had knocked twice and then once was going to come back. Lucien came up behind her. He had the gun. She felt him assess the situation in the way she'd learned he assessed things, quickly, completely, without visible reaction. She felt him raise the weapon. "Don't," she said. "Naomi." "He's standing in front of a room full of people," she said. "You miss, you hit someone behind him. You hit, he still gets to the door before he goes down." She didn't take her eyes off Magnus. "Don't." The gun stayed up for a moment. Then she felt Lucien lower it. Magnus watched this. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like a man checking a box. "Come out," he said again. And that was when the lights went out. Not gradually, not a flicker. All of it at once, the overhead fluorescents, the accent lights, the neon beer sign in the window that had been buzzing its one note all night, the exit light above the front door. Everything. Simultaneously. The diner went dark as the inside of a closed fist. 3 seconds of silence in which nobody moved. Then, from somewhere outside the building, a sound she had not expected. A sharp metallic impact, once, followed by something heavy hitting concrete, followed by nothing. Then a voice from outside the front door. Not yelling, not announcing, quiet and direct and aimed inward through the glass. "Viscari, it's time to end this." Victor Renko had arrived. He hadn't been outside the building coordinating his people through a phone in a car somewhere at a safe distance. He had been waiting. He had been waiting for the moment when his people had the room secured and the exits covered and the target unable to move. He had been waiting for the moment when there was nothing left to do but walk in and finish it. Naomi stood in absolute darkness in the middle of the Lucky Spoon diner with no gun, no leverage, no reinforcements, a mafia boss behind her who had just been comprehensively betrayed by his own closest associate, an unconscious server on the floor, a family locked in a bathroom, a 7-foot assassin who now had his hands free somewhere in the dark ahead of her, and the man who had built all of this walking toward the front door. 3 layers down. She had found the 3rd layer. The 3rd layer was that there was no version of this night that ended quietly. There was no corridor under the building that led somewhere safe. There was no gap in Renko's plan large enough to walk through. Renko hadn't left a gap. Renko had left an appearance of a gap, which was something she understood from the inside of her own survival history was entirely different. The question was not whether she could survive this. The question was who she was going to have to become in the next 10 minutes in order to try. She had spent 11 years becoming someone who wasn't defined by the worst things that had ever happened to her. She was now standing in the dark, wondering whether the worst things that had ever happened to her were, in fact, the only preparation she had for what was about to come through that front door. The door handle moved. Naomi took a breath, and she made a decision that she knew, with complete and terrible clarity, she could not take back. The door opened slowly, not kicked in, not rushed. It opened the way a man opened a door when he had already won and wanted everyone in the room to understand that before he said a single word. Viktor Renko was not what she had pictured. She had pictured, without consciously picturing anything, someone who looked like the weight of what he did, someone who carried it visibly. Instead, the man who stepped through the door of the Lucky Spoon was medium height, medium build, somewhere in his early 40s, wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt with no tie. His hair was cut short and had gone gray at the temples in a way that looked almost respectable. His face was the kind of face that got described as ordinary. Not ugly, not striking, just a face that existed in a room without demanding attention. His eyes were different. His eyes were the part of him that matched what she knew he was. He stood in the doorway and let them adjust to him, the way you let a room adjust to a temperature change. And he looked around the diner with the unhurried inventory of a man checking his own property. His gaze moved across the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the sparking remnants of the light fixture, Carl motionless on the floor. It moved to Magnus, standing in the dark center of the room, to the second man beside him, to the kitchen entrance where Naomi stood with Lucien one step behind her. It stopped on Lucien. "You look terrible," Renko said. His English was accented but precise. "Sit down before you fall down." Lucien said nothing. Renko stepped fully inside and let the door swing shut behind him. He didn't have a weapon in his hands. He didn't need one. Magnus was 12 feet away and functional. The second man was armed. There were at least 2 people outside. Renko moved through the room like someone who had already done the accounting and found the numbers satisfactory. He pulled out a chair from one of the few tables still upright and sat in it, backward, arms resting on the top rail. He looked at Naomi. "You're the waitress," he said. She didn't answer. "Magnus told me about you," he said, "over the radio before—" He made a small gesture toward Magnus's wrists, the missing zip ties. "He said you were fast, that you anticipated." He tilted his head slightly. "He doesn't say that about people." "I don't care what he says about people," Naomi said. Renko looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think you do." He turned back to Lucien. "Sit down, Lucien. I'm not going to ask again." "Then don't ask," Lucien said. Something moved through Renko's face. Not anger, closer to disappointment, which was worse. "You never did know when something was finished," he said. "That was always the problem with you. You'd hold on past the point where holding on made any sense." "Victor, Greco is in federal custody," Renko said. "Your accounts are frozen. The Halstead operation, the River North arrangement, the 3 shell companies in Delaware. All of it, simultaneously, tonight." He said it calmly. He said it the way you told someone what the weather was. "There is nothing left to hold on to. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to close the book." "You used my infrastructure," Lucien said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but the layer under the control had shifted. She could hear it, the thing that lived below the discipline. "You used everything I built, for trafficking, children, Victor." "People," Renko said. "Adults, mostly." "Don't." "I'm correcting the record." "Don't," Lucien said, and this time the word came out with an edge that cut through every other sound in the room. "I saw the files. I saw what moved through my roots. Don't stand in front of me and correct the record." Renko was quiet for a moment. She went sideways, not forward, cutting across the room at an angle that took her toward the counter rather than toward Magnus, and she grabbed the first thing her hand found on the counter surface. A steel napkin dispenser, heavy, the old kind, full, and she threw it at Renko. Not Magnus. Renko. Magnus was the weapon. Renko was the hand holding the weapon. Interrupt the hand. The dispenser hit Renko in the shoulder. Not the head. She'd aimed for the head. She'd missed by 8 inches. And the impact made him step sideways, and his composure cracked for exactly 1 second, the first crack she'd seen in it, and in that second she heard Lucian move. Magnus had shifted his trajectory toward her. She was the variable. She was the thing disrupting the sequence. And she was not going to win a direct engagement with Magnus Crane. She had established that definitively in part one of this evening, but she did not need to win. She needed to cost him time. She grabbed the counter edge and vaulted over it. It was not graceful. She caught her hip on the edge and came down behind the counter on one knee, and her palm and the pain was sharp and immediate, and she filed it. The gun was somewhere. Lucian had it. She'd given it to Lucian. And behind the counter there was the coffee station and the small prep area and the thing she was actually looking for, which was the order spike. A steel spike mounted on a weighted base that Stavros used to impale completed order tickets. 8 inches of sharpened steel on a cast iron base that weighed approximately 2 pounds. She had it in her hand when Magnus came over the counter. He came over it the way she imagined things came over walls when walls were insufficient. Not quickly exactly, but with a totality that made quickness irrelevant. She drove the spike base into his kneecap. His knee buckled. He caught himself on the counter edge and did not go down, but he did stop for the 3 seconds it took his nervous system to process the input and override it, and 3 seconds was what she needed. From across the room, a shot. Then another. She came up from behind the counter and Lucian was still standing, which told her he had fired rather than been fired upon. And the second man, the kitchen man, was against the far wall with his hand pressed to his upper arm, the weapon no longer in his hand, the weapon on the floor. And Lucian was moving toward Renko with the gun, and Renko was already in motion in the other direction. Renko moved toward the bathroom hallway. She understood it the same instant Lucian did. Renko had watched Magnus fail twice. He had watched his safety get shot. He had watched a waitress vault a counter with a steel spike, and he had made the recalculation that professionals made when the variables turned against them. He was not going to fight his way out. He was going to change the nature of the situation. And the nature of the situation was currently that there was a locked bathroom door with people behind it who had not consented to any of this. "Lucien," she said. Not a warning, a direction. Lucien cut left to intercept Renko's angle. Magnus's hand closed around her ankle. She went down hard on the rubber mat behind the counter. The spike skittered out of her grip. Her chin hit the mat and she bit the inside of her cheek and tasted copper, and Magnus was pulling her backward across the floor with one hand, the other braced on the counter. His knee still wrong, but his grip completely unaffected by the state of his knee. She grabbed the base of the coffee station with both hands. The station was bolted to the counter. It held. She held. Magnus pulled. The pain in her shoulders was structural, the kind that came from joints being asked to do something joints weren't designed for, and she breathed through it the way she had breathed through other things that she would not think about right now, and she held. "Let go," Magnus said. "No," she said. He pulled harder. She felt her grip on the coffee station base shift. Not release, shift, her palm sliding on the steel. And she changed tactics. She stopped holding and pulled instead, using his pulling force to bring herself toward him rather than being dragged, changing the direction of the load. And she got enough slack to get her free leg under her, and she kicked backward with everything she had, heel to his forearm. His grip broke. She was already turning, already coming up, already looking for the spike or a counter edge or a coffee pot or a dirty fork or anything at all that was within arm's reach. The dirty fork. It was still there. The original fork. The one that had started this, still lying on the floor where it had skidded earlier in the fight, near the base of the booth. She had registered its position earlier in the way she registered everything and never consciously noted. It was 4 feet to her left. Magnus was between her and it. From the hallway, Renko's voice, sharp and short. Then Lucian's voice, something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger. Something more controlled and more dangerous than anger. Then a sound she couldn't identify. Impact and scrape, and then nothing. Then Lucian said, "Victor, don't." She needed to get to that hallway. She needed to get there now, and she had Magnus between her and everything. She looked at him. He looked at her. His knee was wrong. His forearm was bleeding from the fork. He had coffee burns on his neck and shoulder. His jaw was still carrying the damage from the first engagement, swollen on the right side in a way that was going to be significantly worse tomorrow, if tomorrow happened for him. He was still enormous. I was still the most physically dangerous person she had ever been in a room with. None of the damage she had done to him had changed that fundamental arithmetic. but he was tired. She could see it. Not in his face was still the controlled blank of a professional, but in his breathing. The rhythm had changed from what it had been an hour ago, deeper, slower to recover between exertions. She was tired too. Her shoulder was screaming from where he'd nearly pulled her arm through the floor. Her hip was bruised from the counter. Her cheek was bleeding inside. She was running on something that wasn't adrenaline anymore. Adrenaline ran out, she knew from experience. It was something older and more stubborn that she didn't have a clinical name for. She grabbed the counter edge and came over it again, same side. And this time, instead of going away from Magnus, she went toward him. Not at him. Beside him. She used the corner of the counter as a pivot point, getting it between them for the half-second she needed, and she went past him toward the fork. He caught her left arm. She let him have it. She went the direction of the catch, pivoted with it, got her right hand down to the floor and had the fork, and came back up and drove the tines into the back of his hand. Magnus released her arm. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She went across the dining room toward the hallway at a run, past Carl still motionless on the floor. Breathing, she checked. His chest was moving. He was breathing. Past the overturned table, past the booth where Magnus had been zip-tied, and into the narrow corridor of the bathroom hallway. Lucien was there. He had Renko against the wall. The gun pressed to Renko's sternum, Renko's back flat to the wall beside the bathroom door, Lucien's arm across his chest. Renko's hands were visible. He hadn't gone for a weapon because Lucien had moved faster than his age suggested, and Renko had not had the resource of surprise. They were locked. Naomi came into the hallway and took in the picture in under a second. Renko looked at her. "Interesting fork," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the bathroom door 6 inches from his left shoulder. "Move him," she said to Lucien. "If I move him, Move him away from that door." Lucien shifted his weight, using the arm across Renko's chest to push him laterally away from the bathroom door. Renko went. He had to go. The gun was against his sternum, and Lucien's arm across him was not decorative. But he went the way things went under pressure that still had agency, looking for the angle, looking for the opening. Naomi put herself between Renko and the bathroom door. She stood there with the dirty fork in her right hand and looked at Victor Renko, and she thought, this is where it ends, one way or another. Not in the dining room, not in the corridor under the kitchen, not at the east door in the rain. Here, in a narrow hallway beside a bathroom door in a diner that smelled like old grease and burnt coffee. From behind the door, very quiet, a child's voice said something she couldn't make out. Something in Renko's face moved, something small and quickly controlled. But she saw it. She filed it. "There are children in there," she said. "I'm aware," Renko said. "Then you know this doesn't go past this point," she said. "Whatever you came here to do, whatever Greco gave you, whatever you've spent 3 years building toward, it doesn't go past this hallway, not while they're in there." There. Renko looked at her with the expression of a man assessing a structural load. "You don't have anything," he said. "The gun is his, not yours. He shoots me. My people outside." "Your people outside," Naomi said. "The one on the south side with the rifle and the one on the roof." She watched his face. "You came in through the front door. What did you hear when you came across the parking lot?" His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You didn't hear anything," she said. "You didn't hear your roof man move. You didn't hear radio check-in. You didn't hear anything from outside because something happened out there, and you walked in here without knowing what." She kept her voice even. She kept it the voice of the ceiling because the room needed a ceiling. "Someone was watching Renko watch Veskari tonight, and whoever that is took out your roof man before you came through the door." "You're speculating," Renko said. "I'm telling you what I heard," she said, "before the lights went out. Metal impact. Something heavy hitting concrete. North side of the building." She held his gaze. "Count your people, Victor." He was still. The kind of still that meant the calculation was running fast. "You have Magnus," she said, "who is currently in the dining room with a fork in his hand and a bad knee. You have your kitchen man, who is shot. You have a South Side rifleman who hasn't fired or moved or radioed in the last 20 minutes. She let that sit. And you have whatever is left on the roof." From outside, distant and muffled by the rain and the walls, she heard something. An engine. More than one, getting louder, getting closer. Renko heard it too. She watched his face do the arithmetic. She watched it arrive at numbers that didn't match the plan. Greco talked faster than you expected, Lucian said quietly. His voice had gone to something past anger, past the emotional register entirely. Just flat, direct, the voice of someone reading coordinates. He gave them what they needed for the federal case, and he gave them the rest as well, because that's what Greco does when he's frightened. He gives them everything. He always has. And you didn't know that about him because you only used him once. A pause. I knew because I've known him for 20 years. Renko's jaw tightened. The people coming, Lucian said, are not mine. Naomi looked at him. They're federal, Lucian said, which is a different kind of problem, for both of us. He still had the gun on Renko. His arm had not wavered. But they will be here in approximately 2 minutes, and the question you need to answer, Victor, is what the next 2 minutes look like for the children in that bathroom. Renko looked at the bathroom door. He looked at Naomi standing in front of it. He looked at the fork in her hand, not the gun, the fork, as if the fork was the thing that was actually keeping him where he was, which was perhaps not wrong. Step away from him, Naomi said to Lucian. Lucian looked at her. Naomi, step back, she said. Give him room. If I give him room, he goes for the dining room. Let him. A pause. He'll go through Magnus. I know, she said. Let him. Lucian took 2 steps back. The gun stayed up, but the physical pressure of his arm across Renko's chest was gone. Renko straightened. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the space beside her, the space between her and the wall that was technically a way back to the dining room. He looked at the bathroom door. I'm not what you think I am, he said. I don't think anything about you, she said. I don't have the time. The trafficking... Don't, she said. It came out with an edge she hadn't planned, sharp and short and final. Whatever you're about to say, don't. I was in it. Whatever version of it you ran or funded or looked the other way about. I was inside it when I was 14 years old. She kept her eyes on his. So don't. Silence in the hallway. The sound of the engines outside was louder now, closer, accompanied by something else. She wasn't sure yet, still muffled by the walls. Renko looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read and didn't try to. Then he moved. Sideways, toward the opening beside her, toward the dining room, not rushing, not fleeing, just moving in the direction that was available. She let him. She turned and watched him go through the hallway entrance and back into the dining room, and she heard his footsteps cross the floor, and she heard him say one word to Magnus. One word, she couldn't make it out. And then the front door opened. She heard the rain for a second. The door shut. From the dining room, Magnus said, "He left." She walked back into the dining room. Magnus was standing near the counter. His hand was wrapped in something. A section of his shirt, she realized, torn off and pressed against the fork wounds. He was looking at the front door. The second man was still against the far wall, one hand on his arm. He was looking at the door too. "He left," Magnus said again. Not a question this time. Just the 2 words. And in them, something she recognized as the specific quality of a person, understanding that they have just been abandoned by the thing they were certain of. "Yes," she said. Magnus looked at her. He looked at the fork in her hand. He looked at his own hand, wrapped in the torn shirt. "The zip ties are on the floor," she said. "Booth 4. He looked at them. "You can sit back down," she said, "or you can walk out the door after him." She held his gaze. "If you walk out that door, whoever is coming is going to find you in the parking lot." The engines were very loud now. Lights were beginning to pulse through the rain-filmed front window. Not police blue and red, something else, something whiter and more directed. "That's your choice." Magnus stood still for 3 seconds. Then he walked to booth 4 and sat down. He picked up the zip ties and he put one around his wrists. He couldn't do it the way Stavros had, not with only his own hands. And he set his wrists on the table. Naomi looked at Stavros, who had come in from the kitchen at some point and was standing near the pass-through with his hands in his pockets and an expression of a man who had accepted that his insurance claim was going to be complicated. "Zip him properly," she said. Stavros did. Naomi walked to the bathroom hallway. She knocked twice, then once. "It's me," she said. "Same person as before. It's over. I'm going to open the door." A long pause. Then the lock clicked. She opened the door. A woman, late 30s, dark hair, a child pressed to each side of her with both arms, 2 kids who were maybe 5 and 8, Both of them with their faces turned toward their mother's shoulder in the instinctive way children turn toward the nearest safe thing, looked up at Naomi from the floor of the bathroom with eyes that had been doing everything possible to hold it together for an indeterminate amount of time, and were now in the presence of another person who was upright and calm, considering releasing some of that effort. "Is it actually over?" the woman said. "Almost," Naomi said. "Come with me. Stay close." She walked them through the hallway into the dining room. The woman moved with her children plastered to her sides, steering them with her body so they couldn't see Carl on the floor or the damage to the room, doing it by instinct, the kind of navigation that was purely maternal and required no instruction. The kids kept their faces down. The older one looked once at Magnus in the booth and looked away. Naomi took them to the far end of the counter, the end farthest from everything, and sat them on the stools there. "One more minute," she said to the woman. The woman nodded. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were wet, and she was holding both children against her sides, and she nodded with the precision of a person who had one task left, which was to hold it together for one more minute. From outside, the lights were fully visible through the window now. White and directed, like Naomi had thought, not law enforcement colors. Two vehicles, she could see the shapes through the glass and people moving in the parking lot, and then the front door opened again. The man who came in first was not Renko and was not anyone she recognized. He was perhaps 50, compact, wearing a jacket that was not quite civilian, with the kind of posture that came from an institutional background he no longer worked for but had never entirely left. He looked at the room the way she had learned to look at rooms, taking the full inventory in one pass, stopping on the relevant data, filing the rest. His eyes went to Magnus first, then to Carl on the floor, then to Lucien, who was standing near the hallway entrance with the gun now held low and visible. The grip pointed outward in the way that meant, "I know you're here, and this is not a threat." Then the man looked at Naomi. "You're the staff member," he said. "I'm the waitress," she said. He looked at the fork still in her hand. He looked at the state of the room. He looked at Lucien with the gun, and Magnus zip-tied in the booth, and the second man against the wall, and Carl on the floor, and the family on the stools at the far counter, and Stavros near the pass-through. "Medic," he said, over his shoulder, to whoever was behind him. Then he looked at Carl and said it again, louder. Two more people came through the door. They went to Carl immediately. The man looked back at Naomi. "Victor Renko," he said. "Was he here?" "He left," she said. "Through the front door 2 minutes ago, maybe less. Direction?" "I didn't see." He looked at Lucien. Lucien looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has just lost everything he spent 30 years building and is now doing the math on what remains. It was not a defeated expression. It was a counting expression, a recalibration. The man looked back at Naomi. "Are you injured?" She thought about it, shoulder, hip, inside of her cheek. The general aggregate of an evening spent being thrown into counters and dragged across floors. "Nothing that requires immediate attention," she said. He nodded. He looked at the fork. "You want to put that down?" She looked at the fork. She looked at it as if she'd forgotten she was holding it, and she had somewhat. It had been in her hand so long it had stopped registering as separate from her hand. She set it on the counter. It made a small sound on the linoleum. Outside, in the parking lot, she could hear voices and movement, and the rain still coming down. Renko was out there somewhere in the dark, and the rain, running or already gone, and whatever he was and whatever he had done and whatever he was going to do next was now someone else's problem, or it was going to become hers again later, but it was not her problem in this moment. Carl was moving. The medics had gotten him upright, and he was conscious, and his arm was wrong in the way of something broken, rather than something catastrophic, and he looked across the room at Naomi with the expression of a man who had just finished the most eventful shift of his career and said, audibly, from across the room, "I should have called in sick." Naomi almost laughed. She didn't, but it was the closest she'd come all night. Lucien was being spoken to by the compact man near the hallway. She couldn't hear what they were saying. Lucien was listening with his arms at his sides and his face doing the counting thing, and occasionally saying something brief that the compact man wrote down. The gun had been taken from him at some point, gently, with a request, which told her something about the nature of the conversation. She sat down on one of the counter stools, not near the family, giving them their space, just the closest available surface that was horizontal and stable. She sat down and she put her hands flat on the counter. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way she noticed things she filed earlier, as information arriving late, now that the queue had emptied enough to process it. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her shoulder hurt seriously, and there was blood in her mouth, and the fluorescent lights that someone had restored at some point were the particular shade of yellow that made everyone look slightly unwell. And she was sitting in that light on a cracked counter stool at approximately 3:15 in the morning in a diner she had worked at for 11 days. And somewhere outside in the rain was a man named Victor Renko, who had walked out the front door 2 minutes ago and had not been caught yet. Not yet. She looked at the front door. It was closed. Through the rain-filmed glass, she could see the shapes of people moving in the parking lot, organized and purposeful. She looked at the counter. The fork was there, small and ordinary and dirty, tines slightly bent from the evening's work. The compact man appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Ms. Mercer," he said. She looked up at him. "We need to talk about Victor Renko," he said. "About what you heard and what you saw tonight. All of it." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the door. She looked at the fork. "He's still out there," she said. "Yes," the compact man said. "Then talk fast," she said, "because I don't think this is finished." And in the parking lot of the Lucky Spoon Diner, in the rain and the white lights, and the organized movement of people who had arrived 2 minutes too late to stop a man from walking out a front door, something shifted. A shadow moving at the edge of the light, at the boundary between the illuminated parking lot and the dark service road beyond the fence, there for a fraction of a second and then gone. She saw it through the glass. The compact man had not been looking at the window. Naomi's hand moved back to the counter. The fork was still there, still within reach. She didn't tell the compact man what she'd seen through the glass. Not because she was withholding it from him. She would tell him. She intended to tell him. But because in the 2 seconds between seeing the shadow at the edge of the parking lot lights and deciding what to do about it, she made a calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something older and more instinctive than strategy. Renko was still here. He hadn't run. He had walked out the front door and crossed the parking lot and gone to the edge of the light and stopped. Which meant he hadn't finished. Which meant whatever he had come to the Lucky Spoon to do tonight, he had not done it, and he was standing 40 feet away in the rain deciding whether to do it a different way. Which meant the compact man and his people in the parking lot were between Renko and the building, and Renko was watching them. And the moment they moved in the wrong direction, the moment the coverage shifted, Renko would see the gap. She needed to know where the gap was before Renko used it. "Ms. Mercer," the compact man said again. "1 second," she said. She stood up from the stool. She looked at the window, at the parking lot beyond it, the white lights, the people moving with purpose among the two vehicles. She counted positions. She looked at the east side, the side with the loading dock, the side the camera didn't cover. Nobody was there. The dock was dark and unlit, and the gap in the fence was in the dark beyond the dock, and the service road was beyond that. The same way she had tried to use it. The same gap in the plan. Renko had watched his people set up tonight. He knew the east side was uncovered. He had known it when they set up because he had been the one who decided to leave it uncovered. There was nothing on the east side worth watching. That was the assumption. That was the original plan. His own plan. His own assumption. She looked at the compact man. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating the nature of the conversation. "Harlan," he said. "Harlan. How many people do you have in that parking lot?" "6. "How many on the east side of the building?" A pause. A brief one. "The east side is nobody," she said. "I know. How fast can you get someone there?" He looked at the window. He looked at the parking lot layout through the glass with the focused attention of someone doing exactly the same spatial calculation she had just done, arriving at the same answer. His hand went to his jacket. 2 minutes, he said, maybe 90 seconds. "He's at the edge of your lights," she said. "On the north end of the parking lot, close to the fence. He was there 40 seconds ago. He knows your east side is open. He built the plan. He knows what he left uncovered." Harlan's hand was already at his ear. He was speaking quietly and quickly into something she couldn't see. An earpiece, a mic, both. And his eyes were on the window, and his posture had changed in the way of someone shifting from one operational mode to another, from debrief to active, like a gear engaging. "Stay here," he said to her. She didn't answer. He moved toward the door. Two of his people outside shifted in response to whatever he'd said into the mic. She could see the movement through the glass, the subtle repositioning that looked like nothing and was everything. She looked at the counter. The fork was there. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the door. She thought about what Harlan had said. Stay here. She thought about the east side of the building, the dock, the broken padlock, the gap in the fence. She thought about the service road beyond it and where it went. She didn't know exactly where it went. She'd only seen it from inside the corridor, from the door, in the rain. She thought about the shadow at the edge of the lights. She thought about a man who had built a trafficking network on the infrastructure of another man's organization and had spent 3 years planning this night down to the coordinated timing of a federal arrest and the positioning of 4 trained personnel, and who had then walked out the front door of a diner when the plan failed rather than running immediately, because the plan failing was not the same as the objective failing. And Viktor Renko was the kind of man who understood the difference between those two things. She thought about the family on the counter stools, the mother with her arms around both children, the older child who had looked at Magnus and looked away, the younger one who had asked a question through the bathroom door that nobody had answered. She thought about what Renko would do if he got back inside this building through the east door, through the corridor, through the dry storage, into the kitchen, and found it full of Harlan's people. He wouldn't. That option was closing as she stood there. Harlan was covering it. His people were repositioning. The east side was being addressed. But there was a window between now and when the east side was covered. A gap inside the gap. 90 seconds, Harlan had said. Maybe 2 minutes. She picked up the fork. She went through the kitchen. Stavros saw her go and said, "Hey." And she didn't stop. She went through the kitchen, past the prep area, past the cook station where Raymond had long since retreated to a corner and was sitting on an overturned bucket doing nothing, which was the correct thing to do. She went through the dry storage and pulled the access panel and went into the corridor. Dark. Cold. The same 50-year smell of concrete and old electrical work. She moved without the flashlight. She knew the distance now. 45 steps, dehumidifier on the right at 20, straight through to the door. She moved with one hand on the wall and her feet testing the floor before each step, and the fork in her right hand, and the sound of her own breathing louder in the enclosed space than it had been the first time. 20 steps. The dehumidifier shape on her right. 25. 30. She heard something. She stopped. Sound traveled oddly in the corridor, bounced off the concrete block, got flattened by the low ceiling, arrived at unexpected angles. But she had been in this corridor twice tonight, and she knew its acoustic character the way she knew rooms she'd been in under pressure, which was very well, and the sound she was hearing now was not a settling building or rain on the dock above or her own heartbeat. It was footsteps. On the other side of the door. On the dock. Coming toward the door. She had perhaps 4 seconds. She moved to the side of the corridor, pressing herself against the block wall to the left of the door, which meant she would be behind the door when it opened, which was the only position that gave her anything, and she set her feet on the concrete with her weight forward, and she held the fork and she breathed out once, slowly. The way she had learned to breathe when the 4 seconds before something happened were the last 4 seconds of one version of reality. The door handle moved. It moved slowly, carefully. The way someone moved a handle when they knew the door was a threshold, and thresholds could go wrong. The door opened inward. Light came with it. Not much. The dock light was minimal, but enough to alter the dark of the corridor. A figure came through the door low and fast, clearing the frame the way someone trained cleared frames, stepping right immediately, away from the direct line of entry, away from where she was. She came off the wall. She didn't go for the body. She went for the arm, the right arm, the weapon arm. Because there was a weapon. She could see it in the dock light backscatter. And she got both hands on the wrist the same way she'd gotten both hands on Magnus's wrist 3 hours ago, and she drove herself into the wall with the arm between her and the block. The gun discharged. The sound in the concrete corridor was catastrophic, not loud in the outdoor sense, contained, percussive, like something hitting the inside of a drum from inside the drum. The round went somewhere into the ceiling. She felt the pressure of it on the side of her face, and the smell of it in the back of her throat. The man whose wrist she had was not Magnus. He was medium height and wiry, and he moved with the controlled panic of someone who had been caught off sequence. And his response to being off sequence was to try to create space, to pull back, which was the wrong response because she was already in the space he was pulling back from, and pulling back just gave her more leverage on the arm. She drove the fork into the back of his wrist. He let go of the gun. She caught it before it hit the floor. She had it in both hands before he had processed what had happened, and she was already stepping back, already creating the distance she needed, already getting the muzzle on him. She looked at him in the minimal light. He was not Viktor Renko. He was one of the outside men, the South Side rifleman, she guessed, the one Harlan's people had not yet reached. I was maybe 30 years old and his face was wet from the rain, and he was holding his wrist with his other hand and looking at the gun she was holding with the specific expression of someone who has just had an outcome they did not anticipate. "On the floor," she said. Her voice in the corridor was strange to her own ears. Flat. Without the ceiling voice quality she'd been using all night. Just direct. He went down. She didn't have anything restraining except the gun, which was not ideal but was sufficient. "Where is Renko?" she said. He said nothing. "You were the South Side man," she said. "You had line of sight to the front of the building. You saw him leave." She kept the gun on him. "Where did he go?" Nothing. From above, from the dock, she heard voices. Harlan's people arriving on the east side, moving quickly. Lights sweeping the dock surface, visible under the steel door. They were here. They had made it. "In here," she called out, loud, clear. "Corridor under the building. I have one of Renko's people on the floor. I need someone in here now." The door opened. A light came in, brighter this time, a tactical flashlight, and a figure she didn't recognize cleared the frame and saw her and the man on the floor and held position. "Clear," the figure said to someone behind them. Naomi kept the gun on the man on the floor until a second person came through the door and knelt beside him with zip ties in their hands, and then she lowered it and held it out grip first to the first figure. She walked out onto the dock. The rain had eased, not stopped. The sky was still dark and wet above the dock overhang, but the violence had gone out of it, replaced by the persistent fine rain that came after the heavy stuff finished and had no intention of stopping but had forgotten how to be urgent about it. Harlan was on the dock. She hadn't expected him there. She'd expected him to be inside, managing the room. But he was standing on the dock in the fine rain with his jacket dark at the shoulders and his hands at his sides, and he was looking at the gap in the fence. "He used it," Harlan said. She looked at the gap. The chain link had been disturbed, not the careful passage of someone trying to leave no trace, but the hurried passage of someone who had run out of time to be careful. The mesh was bent farther back than it had been when she'd looked at it from the dock earlier. "When?" she said. "Couple of minutes ago," Harlan said. "We got here just in time to see him clear the fence." "Did you—" "We lost him on the service road," he said. "There's a vehicle, sedan, dark color, no plates, parked a quarter-mile north. He was in it and gone before we got there." She looked at the gap in the fence. She looked at the service road beyond it, the faint dark stripe of it visible between the fence and the tree line, lit by nothing, going somewhere she couldn't see. "He's gone," she said. "For tonight," Harlan said. He said it with the particular inflection of someone for whom for tonight was a professional assessment rather than a concession. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means we know significantly more about Viktor Renko's operation tonight than we knew this morning," he said. "It means Greco is in custody and talking. It means we have 2 of Renko's people in there," he gestured toward the building, "and one on this dock and a body on the north side that I need to walk you through in a minute." "A body," she said. "The roof man," Harlan said. "North side. He didn't make it when— We're still establishing the sequence." She thought about the metallic impact she'd heard before Renko came through the door, the heavy thing hitting concrete. "Who?" she said. Harlan looked at her with the measured expression of someone deciding how much was immediately relevant. "Someone who was watching tonight," he said. "Not ours, not Renko's. Someone independent who had an interest in the outcome." He paused. "We're working on the identification." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the gap in the fence. She thought about the shot before Magnus walked through the door. The shot that Lucien had said wasn't his people, said without certainty, said with the particular register of someone who wasn't sure what his people were doing on any given night anymore. She thought about Greco. About 20 years of Lucian knowing that Greco gave everything when he was frightened. About the federal timing and the physical timing arriving together, and whether that could be a coincidence, and whether it could be something else. She thought about the third layer. Then she stopped thinking about it. She stopped because she was standing on a loading dock in the fine rain at 3:30 in the morning with a shoulder that needed ice and a hip that needed more than ice and the inside of her cheek that had stopped bleeding but had not stopped hurting, and the thinking could continue later. It would continue later. That was not in question, but right now she was finished. She went back inside. The diner had changed in the way that places changed when the event was over and the aftermath had begun. The urgency was gone. Not the damage, not the people, not the ongoing processing of what had happened, but the specific quality of the air in a room where something is actively occurring. That was gone. What remained was quieter and more permanent. Carl was sitting on a stool near the register with his broken arm splinted by one of Harlan's medics. Improvised, 2 steel spatulas and a roll of tape that had come from somewhere in the kitchen, which Carl was examining with the expression of someone who had not expected his evening to involve being a medical supply improvisation. He looked up when Naomi came back in. "You went out there," he said. "Yes," she said. After he said, "Stay here." "Yes." Carl looked at the splinted arm. "Did it work?" "We got one of his men," she said. Carl nodded slowly, processing this in the way he processed most things, carefully, without commitment to an emotional response before all the information was in. "The man in the parking lot?" "The service road." "Right." He looked at the arm again. "I'm going to need time off," he said, "from this job, if it still exists." She looked at the room, at the overturned tables, the broken glass, the long dark scorch mark on the floor where one of the suppressed rounds had hit, the remnant sparking that had finally stopped from the damaged light fixture, the dried coffee in an arc across the area near the counter, the steel counter itself with a gouge in the edge where a round had deflected. She looked at Stavros, who was talking to one of Harlan's people near the pass-through window. I was using his hands, explaining something with the gestures of a man accounting for everything. The sequence of events, the access panel, the utility corridor, the east door, all of it laid out in the air with his palms and fingers, while the other person wrote things down. Stavros looked across the room at her. He didn't say anything. He raised his chin slightly, the universal gesture of, "You okay?" And she returned it, and that was the whole conversation. And it was sufficient. She looked at the family. The mother was still on the counter stools at the far end, but different now. She had the younger child on her lap and the older one beside her, and she was talking to them quietly, her head bent toward them, her voice too low for Naomi to hear from across the room. The older child was listening with the focused expression of a child receiving information that they understood to be important. The younger one had their face in the mother's shoulder. The mother was rubbing the younger one's back in slow circles, automatic, continuous. She looked like she had been doing it for hours. She probably had. Naomi sat down on the stool nearest her. Not at the family's end, at the other end of the counter, near the register, near Carl. She sat down and she put both hands flat on the counter and she looked at the surface of it, the laminate that had been replaced at some point since the original build, the water ring from a coffee mug someone had set without a napkin under it, the small crack near the far edge that had been there long enough to gather a thin, dark line of accumulated kitchen residue. She had been looking at this counter for 11 days. It was the counter she had stood behind when she'd gotten orders wrong and apologized and dropped things, and been invisible in the way new people in service jobs were invisible, unremarkable, not worth the attention, just the girl with the borrowed apron who didn't know where the extra napkins were. She looked at it for a while. Lucien appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room. He sat on the stool one away from her, leaving the buffer of an empty stool between them, which she noticed and which told her something about his particular form of social intelligence. And he put his hands on the counter in front of him and looked at the same surface she'd been looking at. The cut above his ear had been closed. Someone had put a butterfly bandage on it, slightly too large for the cut, which meant it had been done quickly rather than carefully, which was the right priority. They sat for a moment without speaking. "Greco," she said. "Yes," he said. "You've known him for 20 years. "Since before I was what I became," he said. "He was a lawyer when lawyers were useful to me for ordinary reasons." A pause. He grew into the other thing over time. He came to it voluntarily. I didn't recruit him. She thought about that. Did you know he could be turned? Lucien was quiet for a moment. I knew he was afraid, he said. I always knew that. Fear is useful when you're managing people. It provides reliability. Another pause. I didn't know he'd been afraid of the wrong thing for long enough to do something about it. Renko, she said. Renko got to him first, Lucien said. 18 months ago, I think, maybe longer. He offered Greco something I couldn't offer, an exit. A version of this that ended with Greco in a different country, with money and a new name and no outstanding exposure. Lucien looked at his hands on the counter. I offered him continuation, which is not the same thing. She thought about what Harlan had said on the dock. Greco is in custody and talking. She thought about 20 years of a relationship that had been built on fear rather than anything more durable, arriving at its logical end in a federal processing room at 3:30 in the morning. He set you up to die, she said. That's what you're sitting with. Yes, Lucien said. Does it feel different, she said, because you understood why? He looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind that didn't spend time on the approach. No, he said. It feels the same. He held her gaze for a moment. Does it usually feel different, if you understand why? She thought about the question with the same seriousness with which it had been asked. No, she said. Not in my experience. Understanding why is for later. For right now, it just feels like what it is. He nodded. He looked back at the counter. Your organization, she said. Gone, he said. Or going. Most of it is untouchable now. Greco knew the architecture. He knew where everything was. He'd been helping build it for 20 years. He said it without visible devastation, which was not the same as without devastation. What remains will be dismantled or absorbed or will collapse on its own within the next few weeks. He straightened slightly on the stool. I have perhaps 4 hours before I'm arrested. I imagine Harlan has been very deliberately not arresting me for the last 40 minutes because he needed my cooperation in the room, and he's a practical man. She looked across the room at Harlan, who was near the front door talking to someone on a phone. Harlan's back was to them. 4 hours, she said, give or take. She was quiet for a moment. What will you do with them? He looked at her. He almost smiled. It was the near miss of a smile, the shape of it without the expression. Sleep, probably, he said. I haven't slept in 2 days. She looked at his face. At the lines in it, the cut above the ear, the way he held himself on the stool with the discipline of a man who had decided long ago that posture was non-negotiable, regardless of circumstances. She thought about what he was. She thought about the trafficking network he'd shut down, the fact of the shutdown, the why of the shutdown, the 3 years of consequences that had followed the shutdown. She thought about whether the shutdown was integrity or pragmatism or something complicated that didn't resolve into either. She thought about a lot of things about Lucien Viscari, and she arrived, as she usually arrived, at the conclusion that other people's moral accounting was not her work. Her work was what was in front of her. Her work was what she could see. The diner, she said. He looked around the room. I imagine it will need significant repair. Stavros doesn't have that kind of money. No. The employees will lose their jobs while it's closed, if it reopens at all. Lucien looked at the room for a moment. He looked at Stavros at the pass-through, at Carl with his improvised splint, at the counter with the coffee rings and the small crack along the edge, at the sign above the kitchen pass that said Lucky Spoon in the kind of hand-painted letters that had last been fashionable when the diner was built. I have 4 hours, he said, and I have a lawyer who is not Greco. He adjusted his jacket with a movement that was almost formal, almost the movement of a man preparing for a meeting. There are things that can be arranged in 4 hours. She looked at him. Not for you, he said. Don't. I wasn't going to say anything. You were about to say you don't want anything from me. I was, she said. Then save it, he said. The diner is not for you. The diner has 11 employees who are here tonight because they work here, and one of them is sitting over there with his arm in kitchen spatulas. He looked at Carl. That is a reasonable thing to address. She let it go. Not because she agreed with the principle of it. She wasn't sure what she thought about the principle. But because the principle was for later and later was a different conversation. Harlan appeared at the counter. He stood on the other side of it, facing them, and he looked at Lucian with the expression of a man arriving at the part of the evening he had been managing toward for the past hour. "Mr. Viscari," he said. "Harlan," Lucian said, "I need you to come with me." "I know," Lucian said. He stood from the stool. He straightened the jacket again. He looked at Naomi. "The fork," he said. She looked at the counter. The fork was there. She'd set it down when she came in from the dock and hadn't moved it. "Keep it," she said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "No," he said. "It's yours." He said it simply, without sentiment, without the weight of a pronouncement, just a statement of fact. "You earned it considerably more than I did." He followed Harlan toward the front of the diner. She watched him go. The slight list in his gait, the controlled pace, the posture that didn't concede anything to the hour, or the damage, or what was coming. At the door he paused and spoke briefly to one of Harlan's people, too quiet for her to hear, and the other person nodded and wrote something down. Then he went through the door. She looked at the fork on the counter. She picked it up. It was not remarkable in any sense. Bent slightly at the outer tine from the first engagement, slightly tacky from whatever had been on the plate it had come off of. The handle was the standard-issue diner type, steel, utilitarian, the logo of the manufacturer stamped into the metal in letters too small to read without looking specifically for them. It was the kind of fork that existed in quantities of thousands across every diner and truck stop and roadside breakfast place in the country, identical, interchangeable, noticed by nobody. She held it in her hand for a moment. Then she set it back on the counter. From the far end of the room, the mother's voice, still low, still directed at the children, shifted in tone. The younger child had raised their head from the mother's shoulder. She could see it from where she was sitting. The child looked around the room with the wide, uncertain look of a very young person who had been told things were okay and was now checking the room against that claim. The room was damaged and lit wrong and had strangers in it and smelled of coffee and something burned. It was not obviously okay by visual inspection. The child looked at Naomi. Naomi looked back. She didn't smile. It would have been wrong. The room wasn't a place where smiling fit. She just looked back, direct and steady, the way the ceiling looked when the ceiling was what the room needed. The child held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the mother's shoulder, apparently satisfied with whatever the gaze had communicated. Carl said from beside her quietly, "You're bleeding." She looked at her hand. The fork had opened something on her palm. A small cut she hadn't noticed, from the dock corridor, or the counter vaulting, or some other moment she hadn't catalogued, now seeping a thin line across the crease of her palm. She looked at it for a moment. "I know," she said. "You want the medic?" "In a minute," she said. She looked at the cut. She looked at the room. She looked at the front window, at the parking lot beyond it where the white lights were beginning to reduce. Vehicles moving, people repositioning, the organized dispersal of an operation concluding. The rain was still coming down in the fine determined way it had settled into, and in the lights she could see it falling, silver and continuous and completely indifferent to everything that had happened under it. Through the window she could see Lucian get into the back of one of the vehicles. The door closed. The vehicle didn't move immediately. It sat, patient, waiting. He would be in there for a long time before he was anywhere else. She thought about Renko. She thought about him on the service road, in the dark sedan with no plates, driving somewhere she didn't know, intact, operational, 3 years of planning come apart in one night, but the man himself still present in the world. She thought about what Harlan had said. For tonight. She thought about what that meant in the long run, and what the long run looked like, and she arrived at no conclusions because conclusions were not available on that subject at 3:40 in the morning with a cut on her palm and an 11-day employment record and a borrowed apron. Some things resolved. Some things didn't resolve tonight. The fork was on the counter. She thought about what Lucian had said. "It's yours, you earned it." And she thought about what it meant to earn something with a dirty fork at 2 in the morning in a room where nobody expected you to be anything other than the girl who dropped plates and apologized. She thought about 11 years of building a life that looked ordinary from the outside, because ordinary was what she had been working toward. Ordinary was the goal. Ordinary was what the people who had taken her at 13 had tried to make permanently impossible. She picked the fork up again. She looked at it. She thought about the display case. The idea that had not formed yet into any specific plan, just the shape of one, something small, behind the counter, a reminder not of what had happened, but of what it had cost to get through it, and what it had been built from. Which was nothing special, nothing trained, nothing designed for the purpose. Just whatever was within arm's reach. She set the fork down one more time. She held her cut hand out to Carl. "Go get the medic," she said. Carl stood up, carefully, favoring the splinted arm, and went to find the medic. Naomi sat on the stool at the Lucky Spoon counter with her hand open on the laminate and the fork beside her and the fine rain against the window and the damaged room behind her, growing quieter by degrees as the night began its slow unwinding toward morning. Outside, the first suggestion of gray was at the absolute edge of the sky. Not light yet, just the absence of the deepest dark. The kind of almost morning that only existed for about 20 minutes before it became something else. She sat in it. She let it be what it was. The medic came and cleaned the cut on her palm and dressed it with more care than the circumstances required, which she appreciated without saying so. Carl sat back on his stool and watched and didn't say anything either, and the two of them sat there in the way of people who had been through something together and didn't need to discuss it to know they had. Stavros came out of the kitchen at some point with 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her and one in front of Carl and went back without commentary. The coffee was the Lucky Spoon standard issue, stale, over-extracted, the particular bitterness of a pot that had been sitting on the burner for 3 hours. She drank it. It was terrible. She drank it all. When Harlan came back inside 20 minutes later, she was ready for him. She sat with him at a corner booth, one of the few still fully upright, and she told him everything. The sequence from the moment Magnus walked through the door, the fork, the corridor, the east door, the shot before the lights went out, the shadow at the edge of the parking lot lights. All of it in order, with the precision of someone who had been storing the details since they happened in the part of her mind that stored things for retrieval. Harlan listened. He wrote some things down. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. At the end of it, he looked at her across the booth table and said, "You've done this before." "No," she said. He held her gaze. "Something like this." She looked back at him. "Something like this," she said. He nodded once. He closed the notebook. "Renko will resurface," he said. "He's operational, and he's resourced, and he knows we know his methods now, which means he'll change his methods. That makes him more dangerous in some ways and more exposed in others." He put the notebook in his jacket. "When he surfaces, the people who saw him tonight, who were in this room, they become relevant again." "I understand," she said. "Is there somewhere safe you can—" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, deciding something. "I'm going to need contact information," he said. She gave it to him. An email address she had created for the specific purpose of receiving communications she might need to retrieve quickly and from a distance. She had had it for 3 years. She had never had cause to give it to a federal agent before. She gave it without hesitation, which surprised her slightly. The absence of hesitation. And then didn't surprise her, because trust was a spectrum, and what she was giving Harlan was not trust exactly, but a recognition of aligned interest, which was a different and more durable thing. Harlan stood. He looked at the fork on the counter. "The evidence team is going to want that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll give it to them." She looked at it. "After." He looked at her. He let it go. He went back to his work. The evidence team came at 4:15. They took the fork with the same systematic attention they gave everything else. Bagged and tagged, a number, a place in the sequence. The technician who bagged it was professional and thorough and held it with the impersonal care of someone cataloging physical evidence, which it was. He would photograph it and measure the bend in the outer tine and note the biological material, and it would become part of a file that would sit in a federal system for however long the case ran. She watched them take it. She was surprised by how little it cost her to watch them take it, and then she understood why it cost her little. It wasn't the fork. It had never been the fork. The fork was just the thing that had been within arm's reach, and what it represented was not the object, but the principle, which could not be bagged and tagged and placed in a federal evidence file because it lived somewhere else entirely. It lived in the 11 years between a door in rural Indiana and a diner counter in Chicago. It lived in everything she had built in those years without anyone's help or permission. It lived in the borrowed apron and the wrong coffee orders and the spilled water and the deliberate invisibility that people had read as incompetence and which had been, all along, something she could not have named but had always known the shape of. She looked at the evidence bag. She looked at the counter where it had been. She looked at the room, the damaged, overlit, terrible-smelling room where she had worked for 11 days and would probably never work again, which was either a loss or a relief, and she hadn't decided which. And she let herself sit with the fact of it, that it had happened here, in this room, at 2 in the morning, and that it had been her, and that there was nothing in that fact that required further explanation or justification or any performance of any kind. The morning light, when it came gray through the window. Proper light now, not the pre-dawn suggestion of it. The rain had stopped somewhere around 5. The parking lot was visible. The space where the vehicles had been, the oil stains on the concrete, the broken piece of something near the dumpster that nobody had yet addressed. The mother and the 2 children had been walked out by one of Harlan's people around 4. The mother had stopped in the middle of the dining room on her way out and looked at Naomi across the room. She hadn't said anything. She'd held the look for a moment and then nodded, once, the kind of nod that was its own complete sentence, and then she had taken her children by their hands and walked out the door. Carl was on his way to a hospital. He'd gone without complaint, which told her how much pain he was in. Stavros was still there. He would be there for a long time yet. His name was on everything. His insurance, his lease, his inventory, all of it was his problem now. He was sitting at the counter with his 3rd cup of his own coffee, which suggested he had either moved past the point of caring about the quality or had never cared to begin with. Naomi sat in a booth by the window. She sat there in the gray morning light with the sounds of the evidence team at work behind her and the empty parking lot in front of her, and her hands quiet in her lap and nothing that needed doing immediately, which was not a condition she had spent much of her life in. She sat with it. She thought about what came next, not the large shape of it, not the question of Renko or Harlan or federal cases or any of it, just the immediate next. She needed to call the staffing agency that had placed her here. She needed to figure out if she still had a job or where she was going to find another one. She needed to ice her shoulder. She needed to sleep for an amount of time she wasn't yet prepared to calculate. Ordinary things. The kind of things that existed before 2 in the morning and would exist after it. She looked at the counter, at the space where the fork had been. She thought about a display case. Something small. Behind the counter, where the customer wouldn't see it immediately, but the staff would see it every shift. The people who came in early to set up, the people who stayed late to close, the ones who carried trays and got orders wrong and apologized too much, and learned the shape of every booth and knew where the extra napkins were. A small case. Unlabeled, maybe. Or labeled with something simple. Not a story. Not an explanation. Just a reminder that the most ordinary object in the room had once been the most important thing in it. She sat with that thought for a while. Outside, the gray morning continued its unhurried arrival. A car passed on the highway. The first regular traffic of the day, someone on their way somewhere ordinary, unaware of the parking lot they were passing, the diner behind it, the particular quality of the light through the front window at 6:10 in the morning on the day after a night that had changed the shape of several people's lives. She sat in it. She breathed. She looked at the ordinary light falling across the damaged counter, and she let herself be, for this moment, exactly where she was, the rookie waitress everyone had underestimated, sitting alone in the quiet of a broken room, more tired than she had words for, and still here. Still here. That was enough. For right now, in this gray morning, in this booth by this window, with the evidence team working and the coffee cold and her shoulder aching and the long, ordinary, complicated, uncertain future waiting past the door of the Lucky Spoon like it had always been waiting, just in a different configuration than she'd expected. That was enough. She had walked into this room 11 days ago with a borrowed apron and an intent to stay invisible. She was leaving it with something else. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. She didn't need to call it anything. She just needed to stand up. She stood up.